So, hey, we all just voted. And now afterwards, it looks like American voters weren't as alarmed about inflation and the sagging economy as many people thought they were. I guess. On a possibly related front, what should we make of the reaction to the despicable attack on Paul Pelosi? And what is the deeper meaning of the race-based affirmative action cases now before the U.S. Supreme Court? We will discuss these issues and much more in today's episode of Independent Outlook. Hello, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, where we try to bring you an independent take on the issues of the day. And as always, I am joined by my friend and partner in crime, Williamson Evers, director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Hello, Bill Evers.
Hello, Graham.
Great to see you, and welcome to everybody who's joining us for this conversation. It's just a little bit past the election. I'm trying to look at the big picture, Bill, and I know you can help me do this, but okay, so I'm thinking back about a year. Just last year, Glenn Youngkin rode parental upset about ideological indoctrination in the schools to victory in the Virginia governor's race. At the time, it seemed like a harbinger. It seemed like it was the first part of a big red wave, but apparently the undecided independent voters in this cycle in November of 2022 were not feeling the way that the Virginia voters were feeling a year ago. A lot of people are scratching their heads. What do you make of it all?
I think that's actually quite right. The independents nationally broke slightly for the Democrats, and in the battleground or swing states, they broke decisively for the Democrats. For example, in the state, they were 28% more for the Democrats. So I think it's kind of complicated. I think, for example, take inflation and the economy. The public doesn't really understand inflation. They see it going on. They're not really sure what's to be done about it, and they're not really sure that the Democrats are to blame for it. Of course, in some sense, some heavy spending took place in the Trump administration, too.
I'll say, yeah. Federal debt grew dramatically under Trump, too.
But more did.
More under
much,
yeah.
Yes. And the rescue plan was completely, the pandemic was essentially over. So it was gratuitous spending where the Democrats threw in, different projects that they had lying around for a long time, and they put them in that. That's not surprising. I mean, politicians do that. So another thing is some of these issues may not have seen that we might have thought were, connected up and down the political system. They weren't really sure that crime was like a federal issue that they should be, turning out congressmen for.
Well, there's something
but of
to
course
that,
actually. It is a governor and a mayor type,
right.
City council type thing. But again, one of the things that the Democrats did is they successfully tarred the Republicans as extremists. Now, this is nothing new. I'm old enough to remember the Goldwater election, and every election since, even if it's somebody that's, in retrospect anyway, looked at as a moderate Republican like Romney. Romney was portrayed as a fascist by the media and the Democrats at the time.
Unbelievable.
So, yes, unbelievable, but they do this. But they had more to go on here. So one thing that happened is they early on started spending a lot of money on abortion. And they found a number of Republican candidates that were not going to allow abortion at all. No exception for rape, no exception for incest. No. Now, there is certainly an argument for not having abortion, and that, why should the fetus be to blame for somebody's incest or something like that? I understand all that, but to the general public thinks there should be exceptions where the physical health of the mother is in danger, certainly her life, where they generally think 15 weeks should be the deadline. This is the overwhelming majority view. It's maybe not philosophically consistent. I mean, but people like Aquinas had some views like that, but that doesn't matter. This is what the public kind of believes. Now, the Republicans had the chance to turn this, to make the Democrats say, oh, you're going to allow abortion right up to 1 minute before the baby pops out. But they weren't, the Democrats successfully, in general, if they hadn't already said something devastating, And still the Republicans were not able to make the Democrats look extreme of abortion under any and all circumstances. So it didn't work out, and they were able to start painting the extremism label. And then
right. And
the
then
fact that Trump had backed a bunch of people and made the litmus test the denial of the election in a sense, in the fraud sense.
Hey, can
so
you
not in,
hold on
not
to
in the sense.
Hold on to that point about the election. I want to go back to the prior point and then move forward again to the election stuff. So on the abortion point, I think it's pretty fascinating that what was, in fact, in 1973, a very dramatic reversal of the status quo in American law when Roe v. Wade was established in the successor cases like Doe v. Bolton. But nevertheless, it's a long time ago in political memory terms. And so when the court overturned it, people felt it kind of the way that it was felt in 1973, namely as a dramatic reversal.
A dramatic change.
That feeling of a dramatic overturning of things that people were used to was a feeling that I think shook a lot of people who don't think carefully about the moral and legal issues. So the court said that Roe v. Wade was mistaken, which literally meant that the states should not have been.
The states.
Yeah, they should not have been deprived of their jurisdiction. So had that been the dominant theme, which
very hard to explain to the public, though.
It's very hard to, but what made it worse, though,
the public doesn't really understand federalism.
Right.
I hate to get into this, but
the public uses the term what government should do and what government shouldn't do, as if it was one unitary whole.
Yes, exactly.
But then Lindsey Graham didn't help the situation because he quickly introduced a proposed legislation to federally outlaw abortion, which, of course, I think if it had been enacted, which it wouldn't have been, but if it had been, the Supreme Court itself, with the current majority, would have ruled against it because there's no enumerated power in Article 1 giving Congress the power.
I agree.
So, but Lindsey Graham...
his heart was in the sense that he wanted the state Republicans to say, no, we'll do that at the state level, and to take it away, and then he maybe would have withdrawn or something like that. I don't know. I'm imagining what he was trying to do. He was trying to change the conversation to get it on what public opinion says that the public wants, consistent or not in what the public wants.
But instead,
he failed. That's right.
Yeah, he introduced the specter of uniform national legislation against virtually all abortions, which just played right into the Democratic Party's message.
Exactly true.
And so, not surprising, really, that people were upset as they were about inflation and the threat of war and the economy tanking. They were alarmed by this other thing on the side.
Yeah. Well, the election thing was not really very good either, because the problem with election fraud, if we're talking about ballot counting, it's very hard after the ballots have been cast to prove fraud. Okay? All you have are a bunch of ballots. Okay? And so the point of voter integrity is to ensure that the people who are supposed to be able to vote can vote and vote without tremendous difficulty, and to block people who are not authorized to vote. And there were valid concerns about all these supposedly COVID-related emergency things, some of which were done by administrative bodies or elected officials, and not by the state legislatures, which were required by the Constitution.
Which looked remarkably convenient to maximize Democratic votes.
just like the American Rescue Plan, the Democrats had a bunch of things that were reforms in election procedures that they'd had sitting around, and they just took them out of the box and pushed them through under the emergency conditions. This is, by the way, how we got the American Patriot Act, too.
That's
the Patriot
true.
Act. The surveillance hawks, the police state people had all these ideas floating around, and suddenly we had a terrible attack on the country, and they just said, okay, let's enact our wish list. So this is always the danger of an emergency setting, is that the government runs amok. So anyway, they did that with this election, and so there are reasonable reasons to be concerned, but none of these audits that were done, and when people started calling for audits, I thought, okay, maybe they'll find something, but they didn't find anything.
I mean, it's worth doing them. If a question's raised, do the audit, you know?
That's fine. They didn't find anything, and that's because of this problem. And I said, you have these votes now. You can't say, okay, I'm tracking this back through some secret method to, the fact that the wrong person cast this. You can't tell anymore. It's a secret ballot. Okay, so it's really, this is why we don't find much in the way of so-called voter fraud, and this is why the rhetoric is, there's no voter fraud. There's probably plenty of people casting ballots who shouldn't be casting ballots, but it's too late after the ballots have been cast. And besides, so we had that problem. So the Trump people, even though they were not phrasing it right, they had a valid concern. So, but anyway, they came out as extremists because they couldn't really point to numbers that were off that would have changed the election.
Right. The magnitude of the error was really the issue, and they've really overhyped the magnitude. It appears
we don't know what the result would have been if they had followed the constitutional procedures for modifying, and maybe it would have been different. But the point is, it just seemed zany. Okay?
Right. That's how it felt.
So, and here are all these candidates that had this as a litmus test. Then, on top of this, the Democrats poured millions of dollars to pick the most outre ballot deniers and so forth.
The Democratic Party supported the worst of the Republicans.
The Democrats picked, well, certainly the toughest to elect. I don't know, worst might be wrong. I mean, we'd have to take it case by case. Some of them might have been okay. But the point is, they were going to be difficult to elect. And the Democrats knew that. They even did polling and stuff like that. They poured money in, and it worked. Every single one of these people that made it through the primary with Democratic money lost. Every single one.
Right.
So
stunning.
That was
not illegal. It was despicable, but not illegal.
No, it wasn't illegal. It was despicable. But
and even Democrats were saying, even Bernie Sanders said so.
Many Democrats, many journalists and editorial pages said this was a horrible thing, but they did it anyway. So this did a couple of things. The abortion issue and the extremism thing upped. We know from polling that the Democrats felt more intensity. They felt more motivated to vote than the Republicans. That's always a bad sign. Right. Okay, and in the midterm, it's kind of really problematic because hopefully you're trying to get people that are upset with the national administration. And the Republicans weren't able to get that. So then another thing
boy, did the Democrats want, for example, to get Doug Mastriano to be the governor candidate in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that was a typical example.
Yeah, and they got him, and and they really were hoping that Oz would be the nominee, the Trump-picked candidate, rather than the other fellow who was more moderate looking. Right. The Democrats really wanted those two Pennsylvania candidates to be the final election ones, and they got them. They got him. And then Mastriano, I mean, the thing about Mastriano is that he may be a good person, but boy, did he do some strange things. Like,
he did.
Primary season, he spoke at a QAnon rally, which had featured a film about John F. Kennedy Jr. saying he was assassinated because he knew too much, and that 9/11 was an inside job. He was standing by smilingly, apparently, while that film was being played at a QAnon event.
No experienced political candidate. No one who'd been state lieutenant governor, state attorney general, top state senator, top state lower house person would do that. They would know. This is, okay, maybe he didn't explicitly endorse this, but this is the kind of guilt by association that raises emotional flags on the voters, and understandably.
And Mastriano had actually threatened that he was going to deregister all Pennsylvanians and make everybody re-register to vote so as to overcome voter fraud. I mean, what a comprehensively overkill solution that would have been. And people were alarmed by these things in Pennsylvania.
Right. That's right.
Not to mention all the overheated religious rhetoric that accompanied all the Mastriano mass rallies. I mean, man,
we're all for religion, but you know, keep it. You know, please make Providence smile on me. Please make God bless America. Don't say I'm getting secret messages from God
right now. It's a prophetic thing that somehow.
Right. That's not what the American public wants to hear.
And they reacted against it.
So we're all for religion, but we're not for imposing a religious vision on the general public. So there was that. Another thing that the Democrats did that turned out to be very wise was bribing the youth.
Oh, so man. We talked about this before.
We did.
It's so true.
It worked. So they had this upwards of $500 billion loan write-off for student college loans. And young people who generally, I just have to tell you, young people don't usually vote a lot.
No.
And they were 28% over the Republicans with the 18 to 29-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the people who have college loans or about to have college loans or trying to wind up their college loans or whatever it is. This is, you know, a freebie to them, and it you know, the federal courts are probably going to overturn this.
Probably,
but it doesn't matter. He bought the votes.
Right.
It worked.
And you know, the timing of it was interesting because I think some 50 million student loan borrowers had to sign up on the federal website just about a month before the election. So that they had literally 50 million people had gone online and literally interacted with this process by which they're going to get all this money forgiven, fresh in their minds.
Right.
And of course, the justification was, well, President Biden's he's fulfilling a campaign promise. But of course, the promise was, I'm going to steal from other people and give it to you, so you should vote for me. So it was a bad campaign promise. But he fulfilled the promise, and so they were reminded of the promise by interacting with the website, and so, you know, you follow through. You vote for the guy who gave you money.
That's right.
Or his team.
So another thing that happened, we all kind of smiled at this while he was doing it, but led by Biden, they had this theme of democracy is under attack. You have to save our democracy.
Right. Now, which meant save our Democratic Party, I guess.
Yeah, all right, but I want to remind people that are listening to this, watching this, that Republicans have done the same thing.
Oh man!
So in the 2016 election, there was famously a article called, I think, the Flight 99 election or something like that, by Michael Anton. And in it, he argued that the Democrats were pushing the American political economy, and particularly the constitutional system, so far away from its correct posture that the whole system was about to tip into totalitarianism if we didn't pick somebody who was a fighter, who would push back with no holds barred, and that person was Donald Trump.
Right.
And this, I'm not saying this was pushed to the general public the way the Democrats pushed this, but it was pushed to the intellectuals.
Absolutely.
And who had many misgivings about Trump, who wasn't particularly campaigning on policy lines, but more on thematic lines. And those lines included, you know, fighting against wokeness and fighting against political correctness and all this, which were valid points. So the Democrats did their own version of this, and they did it very successfully. 44% of the voters said that their most important concern, their most important consideration in voting was the threat to democracy. This was almost as high as those who said it was inflation.
Yeah, it's
so
amazing.
It is amazing. And as I said, the public doesn't really understand inflation. The Democrats did a law called the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course had nothing to do with that.
It increased inflation.
Would increase inflation.
But your point is a really good one, though, Bill, because put the two strategies side by side, you see that on both sides, both in the 2016 campaign and then in this latest campaign, either party, both parties portrayed kind of a fundamental,
an extremist situation.
Yeah, a fundamental threat to the republic. If you don't vote
So what
for-
happened was each side mobilized their base, and the independents split, except that in the battleground states, the independents tipped even more toward the Democratic side. Presumably, the Democrats put more money in those states. So that's why we have the result that we're looking at. So we have kind of a normal midterm, despite the crime, the inflation, the education indoctrination, all these things. So the red wave we had swept over Florida, and that's about it.
That's about it, yeah. I mean, maybe Ohio counts. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Maybe, but in other cases, I mean, let's just be honest that the kind of the looming factor behind a lot of the discomfort and misgivings among independent, unaffiliated, undecided voters had to do with the personality of Trump behind many of these candidates.
Well, yes. So not only was the litmus test there, but the Mar-a-Lago raid, which was pretty much uncalled for. They could have negotiated it out. The January 6th committee hearings, which
seemed partisan, even though they made some good points.
Yeah, they made some good points. And yes, it would have been smarter if Trump had said, get out of the Capitol building, you guys, earlier and so forth. But it's not as if we have evidence that Trump gave orders to some set of people, the oath takers or the oath keepers or the Proud Boys, and said, go overpower the legislators or something like that. He didn't do that, okay? So it was kind of sins of omission mostly, and maybe rhetorical excess. And
well, that's for sure.
So, but it kept his problematic nature in the headlines. And then in the closing days, he spends his time teasing the public. Oh, I'm about to. So many pundits and politicians said, don't declare before the election. You'll make the election about you. You'll vote. You'll motivate the other side to vote. Yeah, so he's teasing the last 2 weeks that he's going to declare on like the 15th of November, whatever date he's going to end up actually doing it. The point is, he's saying that, yeah, and you're going to be happy, you're going to be this, we'll take back the White House and so forth. So he and Biden are both teasing the public that they're going to formally declare. So that, plus the massive rallies in the last few days, again, motivated the Democrats to come out, and the anti-Trump, there's polling that says, did you vote the way you did because you're against Biden? And then there's, did you vote the way you did because you voted against Trump? A larger number said they voted this way because they're against Trump.
But it's fascinating, though, in Georgia, the two key candidates there for governor and for, what's Raffensperger's position, Secretary of State, Brian Raffensperger, those two were especially the objects of Donald Trump's ire. They had stood against him. They're conservative Republicans. Donald Trump, vilified them publicly. And so the ones in Georgia who split their votes, apparently, they voted, the independents split in favor of those two Republican candidates in Georgia for governor and secretary of state. Maybe not only in spite of Trump having been against them, but maybe because of Trump having been so against them, oddly enough.
It's very hard to tell. We'll need some more detailed polling, but, that election has gone to a runoff, and I think, absent dramatic new developments, I think Herschel Walker still has a pretty good chance of ending up with the seat.
Well, the only way that I think that the major way where he might be weak in the December 6th runoff is if Donald Trump declares for the presidency and then proceeds to make the Georgia election between
a referendum on him,
on himself. Yeah, and in that case, I think the chances of Walker winning go down.
Well, DeSantis could decide to get in there a lot too, and kind of not make it not just Trump. I don't know. We have great crystal balls.
Yes, we do.
Perfect, the two of us.
That's right.
So, anyway, this is all important because, who's the Senate covers who are the
Right. They confirmed the
judges,
nominees.
the federal judges, and the House predicts what sets the agenda for investigations. So they're going to probably look at Hunter Biden and influence peddling and all the spending bills, the power of the purse. Exactly.
So
House
very
initiates
crucial. So some of the reactions after the election were pretty interesting. So, for example, not that I follow her, but I did notice Ann Coulter's piece the day after the election where her headline was, "A Nation Rejoices, a Humiliating Defeat for Trump." And then USA Today, oddly enough, agreeing with Ann Coulter, USA Today said, to survive an attempt to rebuild its image, an image voters clearly rejected in the election, the Republican Party needs to get past Trump. So that's both Ann Coulter and USA Today saying the same kind of thing. I don't know, but it's surprising to see.
Well, obviously for different reasons. I mean, right. Ann Coulter felt that Trump should have figured out how to build the wall, whatever it took, if he had to go down there and put the bricks one on top of each other himself. And he disappointed her in that respect. I have to sympathize with him that it's not just that easy to. The president has to cooperate with other parts of the government to get things done. So anyway, so she was disappointed that he wasn't Trumpian enough for her, or Coulter-ish enough for her.
Well, so stepping back a little bit to bigger themes, Bill, you and I mean, we disagree on some things perhaps, but we certainly share a common agreement on the importance, for example, of the rule of law, of private property, of individual liberty. And from the point of view, and fiscal probity, I would add, and security, from the point of view of those kind of concerns, it's certainly no longer a clear-cut choice between party and party. I mean, both parties seem to have their problems with respect to those themes. I was struck, for example, as I'm sure you were, by how the Republican candidate in Ohio, who did win, Mr. Vance, he seems to not really to embody that approach to public policy. Am I right?
Well, he gave an interview in which he was asked about the administrative state. So this is the bureaucracy and so forth, the civil service, and what to do about it.
Shrink it.
And the historic Republican, conservative, and libertarian position is shrink it, roll it back, confine it to fewer functions, and cut the numbers and so forth.
I voted for Ronald Reagan because he was going to eliminate the Department of Education. He tried. He couldn't get any. He couldn't even get the Republicans in the Senate to help him. No. But anyway, the point is that Vance said that he thought, no, we shouldn't deconstruct it. I'm using his language here. We shouldn't deconstruct it. We should populate it with our people. So his idea with the administrative state is to keep it, but just put in people that agree with him into the position. So that's not really what you and I, Graham, would rather that he do. That's regrettable.
I will also say on this theme of administrative overreach and rule of law and so forth, and some of our earlier thoughts about emergencies, running away with emergencies, that two of the big victors were Gretchen Whitmer and Governor Hochul in New York State. So Whitmer is in Michigan. And, Whitmer is the one that claimed, I only closed the schools for 3 months. No. It was 2 years. You were among the most extreme. Maybe your exact fingerprint of your words only covered the 3 months part, but your administration and your state had one of the most extreme shutdowns. And she essentially, remember, her husband was caught out on a ship or something.
I remember.
A sailboat. And she had everybody under house arrest. And that was why it was hypocritical that her husband was out on a ship. Couldn't have been safer. I mean, he's out on
it was a
Great
Boris
Lake,
Johnson situation.
By outside. Yeah, but I mean, still, it was an insane house arrest situation. And so Hochul followed the preceding Cuomo thing. So remember, Cuomo was such a hit with the elite thinking people
until
and
it all
media
went south with
like.
COVID.
Well, and
things.
look what he did. He put the infected people in the nursing homes. He overshot things. Both Whitmer and Hochul had stringent requirements for kids to go back to school.
Mm-hmm.
The kids didn't need to get vaccinated. They're not going to get it, or if they get anything, it's going to be a very mild case. There's tons of evidence on this. We have European countries that had the schools running the whole time, no different from the countries that had lockdowns. And Florida was pretty much open the whole time. So the point, except at the very beginning, they did have a brief shutdown. The point is, these guys won in a romp, despite spitting in the eye of the liberties of the people.
They did.
So it was a mixed bag. I think it's good that the Republicans won the House. I think that's very good.
Do you know much about Jared Polis in Colorado Democratic governor?
I only know that there was a fascinating article that called him something like a tax-cutting Democrat.
Right.
Something like
That's
that.
why I'm mentioning him. He's very
and
interesting.
he did fine. He did fine.
He did really well. And even though he
yeah.
supported school choice, and he's on record as saying
Yes.
he wished Colorado's income tax
He's
was
good
zero.
on school choice. He's very good on school choice.
And
it's very unusual for a Democratic politician.
He talks a good talk on taxes, too.
Yes. So I will mention another peculiarity of the aftermath of the election. So there are lots of pundits and editorial pages that are saying, this is all now DeSantis's game and Trump repudiated, blah, blah, blah. But you'll notice that no elected politician is saying, no elected Republican is saying that.
Mm-hmm.
So whether they think that the public isn't wanting to hear this, or they're worried about Trump criticizing them, or whatever it is, this is all pundits. This is, Murdoch's publications, the Wall Street Journal, which was always skeptical about Trump, and now the New York Post, which was generally pro-Trump, but it's now turned against him. So, and of course, all the never-Trumper Republicans are just dancing a jig over this. I think.
Yes, they are.
I think
You're right.
DeSantis did remarkably. I mean, his state legislature, he now has a veto-proof majority.
He got a majority of votes in Miami-Dade County for the first time.
Yes,
for Republican
unbelievable.
In 20
He
years.
did so well with Latino voters. And he gave a great speech. A lot of people say, "Oh, DeSantis is too wooden." His victory speech was very dynamic, very compelling. So I think, he has some good prospects. It's a tough, if Trump wants it, it's going to be tough for anybody else.
Especially if the field remains divided on the Republican side.
Well,
obviously,
it's easier for Trump to win the more people who get in the game. So if Pompeo and Nikki Haley and DeSantis and Mike Pence, if these guys all get in, they'll divide the field up the way it happened in 2016. If it's just DeSantis versus Trump, it's going to be more complicated for Trump.
That'll be interesting. So listen, can we turn the page? Because here we are across the bay from San Francisco. Can we talk for a few minutes about Paul Pelosi? I think.
Yes, I know him slightly, by the way.
Do you really? Okay.
So socially, I don't. One time I was at the San Francisco Opera, and his wife and he were there, and he introduced me to her and told her how much I. Also, my wife was with me. She met Madam Pelosi, and he told her that how much I knew about education, and so I know him slightly. I do think there are two sets of weird conspiracy theories that went on here. So the liberals and progressives tried to say, well, this proves we need gun control. Not that guns were particularly involved. Obviously, we're not going to have hammer control. But, this proves this and that. And also, main thing is they pointed to his crackpot right-wing views that he had. He had several QAnon-type yes.
attacker.
Yeah, the attacker did, not Paul. Not
Right.
Paul. Paul had
Not
standard
Paul,
Democratic. No, standard business Democrat, probably slightly more conservative than his wife. But anyway,
But this
the point
DePape
is,
guy,
I have no reason to believe that.
DePape did have some weird views, some of which were,
Yes,
I
he did.
guess, you could characterize as right.
But he had also cultural leftist views. He made jewelry with macrame with peace symbols on it. He was a nudist. He lived in Berkeley when he lived indoors at all.
And the place he lived in Berkeley was festooned with BLM flags and LGBTQ flags and so forth.
He obviously was a very, to put it generously, he was a very mixed up person. Mm-hmm. And so then also the right wing tried to portray this as some sort of homosexual rendezvous gone bad. And I think there's absolutely no evidence for that. And it was really wrong.
That was disgusting to even insinuate that.
But anyway, it was insinuated. So the most interesting piece of this that I saw was people pointing out kind of if this had been somebody else than Paul Pelosi and somebody who wasn't indicted on a federal charge the way this man was, the guy would have been on the streets the way the justice is done in San Francisco. He would have been released to be on the streets again. It's only because he attacked one of the politically elite people in the country and was subject to federal indictment that he's not free and walking Haight-Ashbury or Berkeley's Telegraph Avenue or something like that right now. So in a sense, there's an equality before the law problem that this case brings up.
There is, and not only that, but I mean, it is true that he is in the United States illegally, having overstayed his visa. He's literally an illegal immigrant.
Yes.
And he's going to be punished a lot
and where
more
are the Capitol Police weren't even monitoring the house. They had a camera there, and they weren't monitoring it. I mean, the Capitol Police, who have security responsibility here, not to speak of the regular San Francisco police, who at least ought to drive by every once in a while. Anyway, it was a failure of law enforcement, among other things.
Yeah, it was. And then, of course, the argument was made by President Biden and others on the Democratic side that overheated Republican rhetoric would be likely to trigger these unstable individuals like this DePape guy. And there's something to that. I mean,
I don't really think so, Paul. I think that the psychology research shows something quite different.
Okay.
People who are really mixed up like this, it can be a picture of a couple on the beach that triggers them. It can be the most benign thing that you would never think would trigger anybody. These people are set off by the most unusual things that we can't imagine. And they don't, this guy, I'd be very surprised if he really, if he could talk about the kinds of things we can talk about. He is just a nutball, and he decided that I was just watching The Crown, okay, and The Crown has the story of the guy who goes into Queen Elizabeth's bedroom. I don't know if you can remember back that far, but anyway, we can sort of remember that. Yeah. So they devote a lot of time to that because he's a working class, regular guy who's having terrible troubles in life. And they seem to spend more time on that than the Falkland Islands, which is going on at the same time in this show. But anyway, so people do this. They decide, I have to bring my thing before the king or the top minister or whatever it is, and that's the only way I can get attention to me or my problems or whatever. And I just think that's what we're looking at here. I don't think there's any grandiose thing of...
And no obvious cause and effect either, is what you're saying.
That's right. I'm saying that. The only thing I am saying is, one, we ought to have more equality before the law in terms of crime and punishment.
Yes.
And two, we had a failure of guarding and monitoring.
Yeah, to which I still would add that even though you can't show a cause and effect, I do think that the political rhetoric needs to be toned down on both sides. I mean, for example, I was reminded by reading a piece by our Board of Advisor member, Victor Davis Hanson, about a couple of incidents of the recent past when Nancy Pelosi herself said about Donald Trump, quote, "I hope he comes. I want to punch him out. I've been waiting for this. I'm going to go to jail and I'm going to be happy," she said. And then, of course, President Biden said he wanted to take Trump behind the gym and beat him up.
Right. He did
and
say
then,
that.
all the famous actors like Robert De Niro said he wanted to punch Trump in the face. And then there was the so-called comedian.
The hanging head, and there was the people at the pink hat march who were saying they wanted to blow up things.
It's
and
awful,
all that stuff.
yeah. And then, of course, Rand Paul was attacked by a neighbor in his yard and so forth. And then
I think this is all deplorable, but
but wait, one more thing before you say the general deplorable, which I agree with. But one last little detail: did you know, or do you recall that after Rand Paul was attacked, Nancy Pelosi and Paul Pelosi's daughter tweeted, she said Rand Paul's neighbor was right. I mean, this has got to be toned. This has got to be toned down.
I remember that. I believe it was Alexandra Pelosi, the one that makes the movies sometimes. She said that.
I mean,
even
if this stuff doesn't make people break into houses and hit people,
it's still very bad for civic milieu, civic atmosphere. Yeah,
right.
I agree.
I'm especially annoyed, when after an event like this, those on one side say, "Oh, it's the incendiary rhetoric of the other side," when in fact the rhetoric is on both sides.
It's bad on both sides.
And then not only that, but on the election denier stuff. So that term now is applied to the Trumpy types who disagree, who say that the election was stolen. But then what about Hillary Clinton? She insisted that the 2016 election was illegitimate.
On the other hand, I think we can say that Stacey Abrams got her just desserts.
Well, she finally did. She was an election denier for the past 4 years, right?
Right. And you think of the tens of millions of dollars wasted on her on Beto O'Rourke. It's like $175 million were spent on Beto O'Rourke's different campaigns for
he was the great
president, senator, governor, whatever.
I don't recall
amounted to nothing.
I don't recall Beto O'Rourke claiming that his losses were due to theft and were illegitimate.
That's true. And I also think I might be just not having a good memory. I don't remember him as having extremely inflammatory rhetoric.
Well, except for hell yeah, we're going to come take your guns.
Come for your guns.
That was the most inflammatory. But that wasn't. I mean, okay. That wasn't like these other things.
It wasn't we're going to use them on you or something like that. So.
One of the strangest things I saw, Bill, watching after the election during the returns and stuff. I was watching CNN for a while, and there were these well-coiffured analysts in New York City were discussing the Texas results, and they were just apparently displeased that Governor Abbott was reelected and that Beto O'Rourke had not succeeded and so forth. But the most striking thing they said was, and did you know that even in Uvalde, they voted for Abbott, the majority. And after the school shooting there, I mean, what were they thinking? And I'm thinking, I know exactly what they're thinking. I want to have a gun on me to protect my kids.
Yeah, and why weren't the police a little more competent? Speaking of schools, Uvalde is a school.
Please do.
We should turn a little bit to some. So lots of people thought, and you mentioned Youngkin at the earlier part of our dialogue here, but lots of people thought that education would be a driver, and it's certainly helped mobilize the Republican side, but it didn't seem to do enough to bring independents and Democrats over to vote for any Republicans. I think it probably helped in this DeSantis case a little bit, and it may have helped drive up some of the Zeldin votes in the Republican candidate for governor in New York, but it didn't have any magical effect.
No, not much impact.
Despite record low National Assessment of Educational Progress numbers in both reading and math. Mm-hmm. And California, which sort of didn't have as drastic a decline as many other places, has its own test, and its own test called Smarter Balance, which is also used in some other states, but on its own test, it's more related to the actual curriculum in California. California did terrible. It went back to the lowest it's ever been on Smarter Balance. So math instruction is in just terrible shape. It has been going down since about 2013 when Common Core kicked in. But
so
it got a lot worse.
Lockdown.
It's not just lockdown, but the lockdown made it dip lower and faster. So we had that, and that, I would think it would have affected more state campaigns than it did. But it's hard to point to it. I think these other issues like inflation and crime and threat to democracy and abortion ended up stronger than they were. The polling that predicted this red wave and stuff has turned out to not really be very accurate. Mm-hmm. And it may have not been accurate on what concerns were really driving the election. So there we have education. We also had some
but wait, before you leave education, what about higher education? Got to talk about the Supreme Court case for a minute.
Absolutely. We do need to talk about that. So there's two cases here, Harvard and University of North Carolina. And they're using race as a factor in their admissions decisions, but questioning from the Supreme Court justices got the counsel defending the universities to admit that it can be decisive. So that means that these students are getting in because of the color of their skin, not because of their other merits. And I think we can say skin color is not a merit or a demerit. It's just what it is. It's a descriptive characteristic. So that, in my opinion, signaled that the court is going to go down against this. And another thing was they kept asking the counsel for the universities, well, when might this end? What would be the indicator? What change in circumstance would lead you to retire this? And I mean, some people, there's a philosopher from Southern California who said racial preferences were wrong then, wrong now, and wrong in the future. But there are a set of people like Sandra Day O'Connor who thought, well, maybe under certain circumstances for a while and then we'll phase them out. But they don't seem to be phasing them out at all. If anything, they're being doubled down on. And that concerns some of the justices. So I think the prospects for this, the universities succeeding in their case, are not really good. And Roberts, who sometimes tries to split the difference or go off on some tangent, Roberts is on record as saying the way to end discrimination on the basis of race is to end discrimination on the basis of race.
That
so I
seems
don't
pretty
think they're going to pick up Roberts.
Right.
So the real interesting question is, since the universities, and both the faculties and all these administrators, there's a huge bloat of administrators whose careers are tied up in racial preferences and in this ideology, what are they going to do to evade what the Supreme Court's going to say? That's going to be, I guess, the question.
Fascinating, yeah. I mean, but some of the statistics are fascinating. I just saw this piece by, I think, your friend or your acquaintance, Lance Izumi, on the subject.
Yeah, a friend of mine.
He pointed to the study by a Duke economics professor who did the numbers and discovered that, and this is how the study reads, an Asian American applicant who is male and is not disadvantaged and has other characteristics that are otherwise equal, he has a 25% chance of admission to Harvard or to, at Harvard in this case. Whereas the same set of factors, but for an African American would lead to a 95% chance of admission.
Right.
I mean, 25 versus 95%, that's stunning, and the only variable is race.
Well, the problem here also is that, looking at it from a student's point of view, the students are going to get mismatched. So the student who should go to University of Michigan instead of Harvard and is going to thrive at the University of Michigan, but is not going to thrive at Harvard, is going to flunk out or get terrible grades. I mean, if you flunk out of college, it's usually a life-changing experience for you, and not in any healthy sense.
No, that's for sure.
So they're going to Berkeley or UCLA instead of UC Riverside, and it's wrong. It's a mismatch, and so it hurts these students. They're there to kind of decorate the student body for the virtue feelings of the administrators and of the faculty.
Sounds patronizing.
It's patronizing, but it's also harmful for the kid. The kid should be in an academic atmosphere where he or she can thrive, can do the work, can succeed, can get a good education. And there's nothing wrong with a UC Riverside education but not everybody can cut the mustard at MIT or something like that. It's just the truth. I think, Graham, you and I can honestly say, even though we both have good educations, we probably would not have been successful at Caltech or MIT.
I don't
it's just
think
true.
I would have been. No, that's very true.
And we've done plenty with our educations, but the fact is that matching is a valuable thing.
You know, obviously the dominant rationale for these ultimately race-based discriminatory practices, as they seem to be, is diversity. And so in most cases, the admissions offices try and get the desired racial result through various diversity criteria. So, for example, apparently to reduce Asian admission numbers at Harvard, again, this is Lance Azumi's work, the admissions office used these personal ratings.
That's right.
Which are not SAT scores. They're not, mastery of knowledge. They're personal ratings on things as likability, integrity, and kindness. And so the Asian students, applicants, were marked way down on integrity and kindness as to get the right racial outcome in the final mix.
And that kind of thing can still be done after. I mean, it's going to be, as long as there's a subjective element in admissions, and selective admissions is going to want to keep that in there, they can keep saying, oh, we're looking at the whole individual. Well, the whole individual was originally put in there to keep the Jews out of Ivy League schools. And so the same kind of thing, they would say, you're not well-rounded enough. You're too focused on your studies, right?
But I mean,
whatever.
I think it's horrible for the implication being that Asian applicants are less likable, have dramatically less integrity and less kindness than African-American applicants. That's just egregious.
Well, they're just using the subjective element they have to get the result they want. And I agree with you. It's calumny against the Asian Americans. But
that's what it is.
These people, they are feeling virtuous as they do this horrible thing. So.
Well, I mean, the thing about it is that this is an area where you and I may see differently. I don't know. I am viscerally sympathetic to the argument of multi-generational injustice. I understand that there's something to that, and that to right some historic wrongs is a valid moral concern. But every mechanism used to right that wrong ends up having far more negative consequences, and even to its beneficiaries. So much as I'm sympathetic to the multi-generational justice argument, I'm just afraid that all the means to that end, which have been tried and advanced, are discriminatory and harmful all the way around. It's sad. Sometimes pure justice cannot simply be enacted by policy.
Well, I also have a certain sympathy for reparation sorts of ideas, but they're very hard to execute, and it's very hard to argue against the person who says, well, all sorts of programs benefited blacks in the past, or benefited American Indians, or were supposed to benefit American Indians, but actually harmed them, or whatever, however you want to look at it. And, the blacks were freed from slavery quite a while ago, and it's not obvious that a Nigerian physicist getting in ahead of an Appalachian white farmer is some kind of exact justice. I mean, I don't think the people who say, oh, we should do it based on class, I don't think that's a really good plan either.
No.
That's just exacerbating those kinds of tensions. I think they should have what we used to have, in principle anyway, is a ranked set of institutions. Some are much more selective and basically meritocratic. I do think there's another argument that we should spend a little time on, which is essentially there's a private property question here. So the universities, at least the private universities, own their campus, and they have a right to decide who can come on under what conditions. And so they can pick whatever they want. If they want to pick people who are the children of alumni or great athletes, so Columbia can somehow be the champion football team of the Ivy League or something like that, or they have a great oboe in the Swarthmore Symphony, they can do that.
Or they have racial
and they want to have, Yeah, and so
let them
that
do
is
it.
an argument. Yeah. Now it gets a little more complicated with the public universities, and we could have a whole exciting discussion on the whole nature of the public university system. But anyway, at a minimum, we could say they're competing with the top privates, the good ones,
Right.
and so they need to be competitive. And
But the thing is that the
mimic them
so-called
in many
private
ways.
universities are taking federal funds, and that's where
Yeah.
the whole thing gets started, because the Civil Rights Act of
Yeah, you're right.
1964 says that any person, any organization
And that's
taking
why
funds,
Harvard is before the Supreme.
Yeah, even
that's
though-
why Harvard is before the Supreme Court.
Yeah, if Harvard did not take any government funds, then they should not be subject maybe to the 14th Amendment on this matter, and maybe they could
And
make their own policies. But they've made themselves
And so
quasi-public.
Hillsdale and Grove City College, which are both fully willing to have all sorts of races and creeds and whatever. in
Hillsdale
them
admitted African Americans earlier than almost every
from the
American
very beginning.
college,
That's right.
yeah.
It was founded by abolitionists.
Right.
But the point is, they don't take federal money because they don't want any of this bureaucratic hassle.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure they still get some anyway. But speaking of the craziness of academia,
which you know a lot
So-
about.
oh yeah. So I was a political science major, but before I was a political science major, I was toying with the idea of being an English major. I love literature.
Oh, you would have been good at that, Bill.
I would have been good at that. But anyway, I'm obviously fascinated with politics as well. But I still subscribe to poetry journals and all sorts of literary things. Those are getting more painful to read too. But the point is, there's been for 150 years the idea that maybe Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote Canterbury Tales and a number of other important early works, medieval works, that he was in a rape legal case in 1380. So he goes back to 1380
Wow.
in England.
The late 14th
And
century.
so there was this document that somebody found 150 years ago in which the word raptus in Latin, so that has to do with seizure. It could be rape, it could be abduction, but anyway, that word is there in this legal case, and there's a woman's name attached to it. So the feminists, of course, just took off in giddy excitement to say, well, he's a big rapist, and the whole of English literature is therefore participates in rape culture, and on and on and on.
Oh, boy.
So anyway, they've been doing this for a long time, and it's gotten more and more, and they've been shoving Chaucer out of the English curriculum. It used to be a required thing if you were going to be an English major, and certainly if you were going to be a graduate student. So they've just discovered they had to go into salt mines in England where they keep the old medieval records. This is just unbelievable what they did. They found the original indictment of this. It turns out it was not a rape case or an abduction case at all. Chaucer and this woman were co-defendants being sued by a man who had been her previous employer.
Oh, my.
So after the Black Death in England, they put in a law that said you couldn't leave your employer without his permission, and also an alternative employer couldn't lure you by offering you more money. So the previous employer sued her and sued Chaucer as poaching her from him. And that's what the lawsuit and the raptus was about, was this poaching of her for this feudal labor law, which, we think you should be able to quit, right? Your work.
So
and
what
go
was
to another
telling about
employer.
this was not the details of the case, but was the reaction to the apparent initial discovery.
Yes. So the feminists say, well, it's still rape culture, and we're still going to teach it all as rape culture. And one thing they seem to forget is that Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales is not necessarily in favor of the people who are telling the tales or the tale they tell. So
Right.
the
He has
Knight's
a critical
Tale,
eye implicitly on
the Knight's Tale is about a knight who he doesn't like. The Parson's Tale is about a petty puritanical guy who Chaucer doesn't like. And the Reeve case, which involves a tale about actual rape, it's not saying that he's saying that Reeve is a good person. And, he's still telling a bawdy tale about it, but it's not, you can't say that he's endorsing this sort of thing. So anyway, they have this. So then another set of people are the postmodernists who think, well, there's not any real truth. You can't really worry about the author's intention, which is what we've been talking about so far. And it's what we, the readers, construct.
It's how we experience
the text. So we have the critical reception, how we experience the text, exactly. So what they said, we don't care about don't confuse us with the facts about Chaucer. We're going to teach it as he's a rapist, and he's part of rape culture. And I mean, this is the epitome of what's wrong with postmodernist, post-factual teaching today in the university.
This is the mindset of the hyper-educated in America to a great degree, which is very sad. We look at them as...
It spills over into other things. I mean, this whole critical race theory and so forth participates in this postmodernist stuff to an unfortunate degree.
And then, of course, there was, what's her name, Donald Trump's political advisor who made the famous comment at one point about alternative facts. Oh, boy.
Yeah, that's an example of postmodernism, but I don't think she... So this was we both know who she is.
The blonde-haired woman, very, very interesting,
Yes.
political advisor.
Yeah, she's very good on her feet. She's very, very clever, and she's got the husband that disagrees with her.
Oh, yeah, right.
But the point is, I wouldn't say she dwelled on that much. I mean, it's true that, let's say, there's all sorts of things about an inauguration. Okay, so how many people were physically on the ground? How many people tuned into it on the radio? How many people tuned into it online? How many people saw it on television? How many people saw it in the United States? How many people saw it in the world? All these different things. You can add them up in different ways. So when the Trump people say one thing and the federal bureaucrats say another thing, well, there might be something to each. I would tend to agree that Trump probably exaggerated the size of the crowd, but given all the other things, maybe a lot of people did watch it. So anyway, so that might be how you could say multiple truths. There's different ways of looking at the same set of facts.
Yeah, I mean, I think what worries me, in the long run, and this is too broad a comment, I suppose, but I wonder to what degree the sense of lack of truth, lack of solid facts that the hyper-educated seem to be propounding as postmodern doctrine over the past 30 years has filtered down to ordinary people, so that even ordinary people are prone to say things like, well, there's my reality and your truth and my truth.
You start to see more and more of it.
Everything is relative. Not just at
we might call it Nietzschean perspectivism comes to the undermensch.
Right. And sometimes you see the same attitudes on, the far right mass populist group as are propounded in the elite faculty lounges in the Ivy League. The same idea that there's no permanent truth that we're accountable to. That really is worrisome.
Well, now, the best example of not being sure of your facts is this Mondrian painting that's hung upside down for 75 years.
How could they do that, Bill?
Well, it's just abstract lines, and so they didn't really know, and it may be an unfinished work. We know how he had it seated in his studio because there are photographs of it, and so that's why. So they've been hanging it this wrong upside down all these years. And it involves tapes. The painting is partly made of tapes. So that if they turn it right side up, it will fall apart. So they have to now leave it.
Dear.
They can only have a picture next to it and explain what happened or something like that. They can't turn it right side up. It's kind of a funny story.
Okay, so we obviously like to have quite a romp, you and I, Bill. We've talked about politics, we've talked about literature and culture and history. Let me remind our friends that you can get probably even more profound takes on many things than Bill and I gave you today by going to the Independent Institute website, independent.org, where we give you a lot of well-researched insights into issues of the day and sometimes deeper issues too. And of course, Bill Evers continues to direct our work in education. I'm so grateful to have somebody with your insight tackling educational issues, Bill.
Thank you. I just wanted to remind our listeners that Randy Weingarten, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, said, well, we should have amnesty for anything that somebody did wrong during the COVID with their lockdowns and stuff. I think she's particularly thinking she should have amnesty.
Don't you think?
Because she pushed the federal government and the local school officials to keep the children out of school when it was quite safe for them to go back.
Yeah, I'm not sure that amnesty is a great idea. I'm in favor of forgiveness, but I'm not sure amnesty is a good way of looking at it. So with that, we do need to stop. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everybody who joined us here for Independent Outlook. Join us next time, and again, visit independent.org for more. Thanks again. Bye, Bill. Bye, friends.
Thank you.